Welcome to today's tutorial. My name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns and I teach knitting workshops. And today we're going to look at different cross stitches or crisscross stitches. So I've done 3 different variations here. They're all basically the same, but they're just different variations using different number of stitches. They're all worked in the same way. So I'm going to show you how to do these 3 different stitches now. The first one we're going to do uses 2 stitches, the second one uses 4 stitches, and the final one uses 8 stitches. So for the first one, for the one that uses 2 stitches, you want a stitch multiple of 2 plus whatever edge stitches you have. For the one that uses 4 stitches, you want a stitch multiple of 4, and for the one that uses 8 stitches, you want a stitch multiple of 8. So to start with, I've done a few rows of garter stitch. I prefer to do this stitch pattern using garter stitch as the background. I think that looks much better. You can do it on stocking stitch, but I think it's most commonly used on garter stitch. The stitch pattern I use is 8 stitches, so the one down the bottom here. Is in quite a few different stitch dictionaries. I've seen that quite a few times. I first used it in a pattern probably close to like 13, 14 years ago, and then I came up with the other versions based on the 8 stitch pattern. I then experimented and came up with these other versions, and I don't think I've seen anyone else do the 2 and 4 stitch version. I'm not claiming that I invented those. Other people may have also used them, but I've only seen other people use the 8 stitch version. You can probably also do a 6 stitch version or a 10 stitch version or 20 stitch version or whatever. But the 8 stitch version is the one that's most common in knitting stitch dictionaries. So I've done a few rows of garter stitch, then I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches just for a bit of an edging. And then to create the elongated stitches, I'm going to go into the next stitch. Now I'm knitting continental style. I will show you how to do it English style as well, but I'll do continental style first. So I've knitted 2, then I'm going to go into the next stitch. Instead of just knitting the stitch and coming back through to finish the stitch, I'm going to wrap the yarn around once, twice, 3 times before I bring the yarn before I bring the needle back to the front and finish the stitch. So you can see now I got 3 loops around that stitch. Normally when you knit a stitch you just have 1 loop, but here we got 3 loops. So let me do it again, continental style. 1, 2, 3, and then bring it back to the front to finish the stitch. In 1, 2, 3, and finish the stitch. You can get very quick doing this with a bit of practice. You just got to remember to count. Let's do it English style. Now I'm not very good at English style knitting, so I'm just warning you, but I can show you the basics. So I'm going into the stitch, I wrap the yarn around once, twice, 3 times, and then I finish the stitch. Make sure after you finish it that you push it back past the sloping edge of your needle. Go into the next one, 1, 2, 3, and finish it. Into the next one, 1, 2, 3, and finish it. I'm going to go back to continental knitting because that's what I'm most comfortable with. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to do the rest a little bit quicker. So as you can see, you can get up a lot of speed, especially continental style, but also English style. You can do it quite quick. You've just got to remember to count. I'm just going to pull out a bit of yarn because my yarn keeps pulling. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then the last 2 stitches I'm going to just knit. This one, don't try and count your stitches because as you'll see, each stitch will have 3 loops. So if you pull them out on your needle, you can see them quite clearly. They're kind of separated. You've got 2 at the beginning, 2 at the end, then all the rest of your stitches have got 3 loops. So if you try and count at this point, it's really easy to get muddled up. So I would be careful about not counting them at this point. Also, one thing that can be a bit difficult if you're using circling needles is if they slide onto the cables, sometimes getting them back on the needle tip can be a bit difficult, just because of the way the yarn kind of winds around your needle. So I mean, I usually use circular needles when I knit this stitch pattern, so it's not a problem, but it can be difficult. So just make sure that your circular needles have quite a smooth join from the needle tip to the cable. And then I'm going to knit the first two because they're my edge stitches. And then to start with, I'm going to do the 1/1 stitch, so the 2 cross stitch or crisscross stitch, whatever you want to call it. I quite often call it cross stitch. I've seen other people call it crisscross stitch, but I'm going to do the 2 stitch version now. So I'm going to go into the next stitch. Now this stitch has 3 loops around it, so I'm going to go in purlwise. So I put my right needle in purlwise. Then I take that stitch off, and as I take it off, I pull those 2 extra loops off. So you got 3 loops, you end up with this really long stitch. Then I do the same thing to the next one. I put my needle in purlwise, I take it off, and I allow all those loops to unravel. So there should be 3 loops, so I let the extra loops unravel. Then I'm going to lift the first loop over the second one. So I find it easy if I grab it with my thumb and my index finger down here, just to tighten it a bit. If it's like that, I find it more difficult to do it, but if I pull it like that, so everything's kind of taut, and it's easier. Then I'm going to put my needle into the second stitch on my right hand needle, so the second one from the tip. So that's the first one, that's the second one, counting from the needle tip. So that was the first one I slipped, confusing. I'm going to lift that one over, and sometimes I need to use my right index finger. Let me do that again. So I'm going to take that first one and lift it over the second one. Okay, so the first one I slipped over the second one. So now the stitches are crossed. That stitch is going through the middle of that stitch. Can you see that? Then I'm going to put that stitch back on my, hang on, I dropped it off and then I put it back on the wrong way, twisted it. So I'm now going to put that stitch back on the left hand needle purlwise, and now you have to try and remember to knit these in the order they are now, so in the crossed order. It's very easy, especially when you just got 2 stitches, for you to accidentally knit the first stitch first, whereas you're going to knit the second stitch first. So 1, 2, that's the 2 stitches. So let's try that again. Take needle in purlwise and take the stitch off, needle into the next stitch purlwise and take it off. So stitch 1, stitch 2, we're going to take the first stitch and lift it over the second stitch. You are kind of, as you're lifting it over, you're also coming off the needle. So it's not like when you do cables, when you're just crossing the stitches at the front of the fabric. You're actually taking that first stitch over so that the second stitch ends up going through the first stitch like that. Then you put that back on the needle and then you knit 1, 2. Let's do that again. Let me try and do it English style this time. So it's put my needle in purlwise and slip it off, needle in purlwise and slip it off. Use your fingers to control your stitches if you need to. One good thing is that if you accidentally drop them off the needle at this point, because the loops are so long, they're unlikely to ravel because they have a long way to go till they get down to the actual stitch. And then I'm going to take the first stitch, and I'm using my right index finger here just to hold on to that second stitch while I take the first stitch over. And then I'm going to put that second stitch that's left there back on the left hand needle and then knit that stitch first. You just got to make sure you knit it in the crossed position. 2. I'm going to go back to doing it English continental style. So let's see how many stitches we got left. Okay, I'm going to do one more. Do one more cross stitch, 2 cross stitch, 2 stitch cross. 1 stitch off purlwise, second stitch off purlwise. I pinch it here. I use my right index finger to hold on to that second stitch while I lift the first stitch over. Then I use my left thumb to keep that first stitch on the left hand needle while I put the second stitch back on the left hand needle, and then I knit the two in that crossed order. So that's the first one. That's 1 over 1 or 2 stitch cross or 2 crisscross stitches, whatever you want to call it. So it's 2 stitch cross because it uses 2 stitches, but it's 1 over 1. Now I'm going to do 2 over 2 on the remaining needle. So I'm going to put my needle into the first stitch and slip it while all the extra loops unravel. 2, 3, 4. So we've got 4 elongated stitches, and then I'm going to go put my needle into the first 2, and you've got to make sure you put your needle in from the left. Don't try and put it in from the right. Put it in from the left like that, and then I'm using my right index finger and my left thumb, and I lift those 2 stitches over so that the second 2 stitches come through the first 2 stitches. Okay, and then I'm going to slip those 2 stitches back to the left hand needle, and then I'm going to knit them in the crossed order. So I'm really knitting stitch 3, 4, 1, 2, and that's the 4 stitch cross. So let's do that one more time. I'm going to slip 4 stitches purlwise to the right hand needle. I've only got 2 stitches left on my left hand needle now. And then I'm going to go into the first 2 stitches. I'm using my thumb and my index finger, thumb on my left hand needle, index finger on my right hand needle. Use whichever fingers you need to control the stitches. Now I'm going to lift the first 2 stitches over the second 2 stitches so that the second 2 stitches go through the first 2 stitches. And then I'm going to put the first 2 stitches back on my left hand needle. Make sure you're just doing it like sliding them tip to tip so you're not twisting them. And then I'm going to knit. So that was stitch number 3, 4, 1, 2. So the most important thing is to make sure that you knit them in the crossed position. If one of your stitches, if for example you drop one stitch off and you put it back on the wrong way around, so it's twisted, I don't think you have to worry about it too much because it's not really that obvious if you happen to knit it twisted, as long as they're not all twisted. Then I'm going to just knit the last 2. And I'm going to just knit a couple of rows very, very quickly, and then we will do the 8 stitch cross. So we've now done 2 stitch cross and a 4 stitch cross, and then we'll do the 8 stitch cross. I'm going to just knit a few rows of garter stitch very, very quickly, and then I'll come back and show you the next one. Okay, now I'm ready for the 8 stitch cross. So I'm ready to do a right side row, and I've knitted the first 2 stitches. So on the right side row, knit the first 2, and then I'm going to do 3 loops with 3 wraps. I'm going to wrap the yarn 3 times around the needle for every stitch. Now you can do the 2 stitch cross with just wrapping the yarn twice around the needle. You may be able to do the 4 stitch cross just wrapping the yarn twice around the needle. I tend to always wrap the yarn 3 times for the 4 stitch cross and the 8 stitch cross, but I have done the 2 stitch cross wrapping the yarn around the needle just twice. I think I did that in my Marminor shawl. You can also do the wrap the yarn around more than 3 times if you want to. The more wraps around the needle, the more difficult it will be to control your stitches though, so be aware of that. So I knitted the last 2 stitches, just plain knit stitches. Then I'm going to turn, so I'm now on the wrong side row. If you want to do this in stocking stitch instead of garter stitch, then you will need to, on this row, because it's a wrong side row, you would need to purl the stitches rather than knitting them. Like I did on the previous 2 versions, I knitted them. If you're doing it in stocking stitch, you would have to purl them. Okay, so we're going to do 8 stitches now. So that means we got to slip 8 stitches while taking the extra wraps off. So needle in purlwise, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, if you accidentally take off 9, then that's fine. Just put the one you got left back on the left hand needle. Doesn't matter if it's still unraveled. You can just wrap it around the needle again like that if you want to, but it doesn't matter if it's unraveled. Right, I'm going to take that off again because that is part of my 8. So just make sure you got 8. Let's just double check. 2, 4, hang on. Let's just make sure I got 8 here. 2, 4, 6, yes, I got 8. So now, and this is a little bit more difficult because you got 8 stitches. So those are my 2 edge stitches. Now I'm going to go into the first 4 stitches. So it is easier if you can pull the yarn tight on your needle. So I put my finger across there so that it's easier to control it. And then I've separated the 2 groups of 4 using my right index finger. I'm going to go in, grab those 4 stitches, and then I'm going to pull those 4 stitches, and you've got to do it all in one go over the second 4 stitches so that the second 4 stitches goes through the first 4 stitches. Now you also got to keep an eye on, make sure that these 4 stitches aren't crossed over. So the first stitch there actually crossed over the second and the third one. So before you actually knit them, just check and make sure they're in the right order. So we'll be doing 5, 6, 7, 8. Then you're going to put those stitches back on the needle. Then you're going to knit them in that crossed order. So you're going to knit stitch number, hang on. What's happened to my, oh no, I was trying to grab the tail to knit with there rather than the working yarn. I thought it felt strange. So I'm now going to knit them in the crossed order. So I'm knitting stitch number 5, stitch number 6, 7, number 8, and then I'm going to knit stitch number 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what it looks like. So let's do that one more time. And then slip 1 stitch purlwise, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Just make sure you keep those 2 remaining stitches back on your needle so they don't accidentally fall off while you're busy doing this. And then, right, second and the third stitches just crossed over each other a bit there. So I'm going to just separate them. Just make sure these are all separated. So that's the first 4 stitches and that's the second 4 stitches. Put my needle into the first 4 stitches. Use my thumb on my left, not thumb, my index finger on my left hand needle if I use the index finger on my right hand needle if I need to. Okay, and then put those stitches back on the left hand needle, and now they have, the first stitch has kind of got caught over the other 3 stitches. I'm just going to make sure that's separated and then knit them in the correct order, so in the crossed order. So stitch number 5, 6, oh hang on, I actually got the stitch number 6 and 7 muddled up there. There we go. So we knitted stitch number 5, 6, 7, 8, and then it's stitch number 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see the stitches crosses over at the front and at the back. It looks exactly the same on the front and the back, and then I'm going to knit the last 2 stitches. Okay, if you need to watch that again, do go back and watch it, but I'm not going to go through it again. Now this swatch hasn't actually been properly blocked, so which is why it's a little bit kind of loose. This does need blocking. Do need to give it a good stretch. So as you're knitting it, before you measure it while it's on your needles, when you get to a point where you need to measure it, just give it a good pull because it does stretch a little bit. Good thing is that when you come to actually do the crossed rows, your piece suddenly grows quite quickly because you're knitting along in the garter stitch and then suddenly you're doing basically 6 rows in one because you're wrapping the yarn around 3 times, so it's equivalent to probably about 6 rows. So it suddenly grows really, really quickly. So you can measure it like before one of these crossed rows, and then it's suddenly grown, I don't know, a couple of centimeters maybe in this at this tension. Okay, so you can see the 3 stitch patterns do look really different, and they all look very effective. I really like all of them, and I've used all of them in various designs over the years. I use the 2 stitch and 4 stitch cross more often than I use the 8 stitch cross, but they're all really effective and they all look really nice. And you can also stagger them to kind of make a more slightly different look as well. So I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. If you have any questions, please ask below this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please give the video a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, and please leave me a comment and tell me whether you've tried any of these stitch patterns before. And if you have any questions, ask below this video. I'm also going to link below to some of my patterns that I currently have that use some of these stitch patterns. Now, I might design more patterns in the future that use these stitch patterns, but I'm just going to link to the ones that I currently have with these stitch patterns. Off the top of my head, it is Marminor, Mapleton. Not sure if there's any, it might be some others. I've done a few for magazines and things over the years, but they're not available necessarily. So I will try and link to those below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.